we're a really informal group, and we really just talk. It's truly, well, as close to a round table as we can get.
Square table.
Yeah. But tonight, I have to admit, what I am showing you, I just put together yesterday. So it's like, I know the subject, but I never sat down and tried to put it all in one place, so forgive me if I left questions at the end, so I don't know. I have lots of slides we can go back to and lots of maps and that. And I wanted to tell you that the way that I first learned about this whole thing is, well, as Gary here knows, I was hired by the St. Charles County Historical Society back in, was that 2010 or 2010?
Yeah.
And I was working there, and one day the archivist at the archives is sort of like the neighborhood shell answer man. You get questions from everybody about everything from the city water department to where are the lines, or where were they in 1880, and things like that. And one day, 2 police officers from O'Fallon had walked in, and they came in, and I was sort of like, okay, we've not had this before. And the reason that they came in, they asked me, they said, do you know who owns Sage Chapel Cemetery? And that was when I first encountered that and learned how it was, had been damaged. And that afternoon, I got in the car with a real kind lady named Lucille Wiggins. Now, for those of you that don't know the history of this area and like cemeteries, you had to know Lucille. Lucille knew every cemetery in St. Charles County. She'd written 5 books on it with lists of everybody. And we got in the car, and she showed me Sage Chapel, and then we drove, and she said, well, let me show you another one. And Lucille at that time was in her 80s at least, and has since passed away. And I really miss her. But what she took me to was the fort and the cemetery there. And at that time, she explained the history of it as she knew it. Now, as I said, everybody knew Lucille. And she had this running, I don't want to say feud with the gentleman that owned it, but right around the same time, a young man had come into the archives and was talking about how they were building a building out in what I think is Lake St. Louis. I now know, municipal maps, this ground lays in the city of O'Fallon. Darn. I would have preferred Lake St. Louis only because I don't know any historical places in Lake St. Louis, so it needs one. I like to spread the glory around. And she explained how the building, as I talk, and I explain this further, and you'll see the pictures and understand better, that the building that this young man was working with the contractor in building, that they had encountered graves. Not actually graves, he never really was clear on that. They'd done the metal detector, and they had taken these headstones that they had found as they built a building in that area and piled them into a corner. Now, Lucille said to me, I'll never forget it, he promised me he would set them up. And I took a tour out there a couple of years ago, or a year ago, with Greg and some other members, and you all saw it. And he did put up a really nice iron fence to simulate a graveyard. All these stones are piled in a corner. I do have somebody that's a cemetery restorationist that has the winch necessary to come and lift the headstones and put them back up. But as he would say, where do I put them? So that's the dilemma, but this is as close to the actual historic site as we'll ever come. What's already been done is done. You can't undo it. But this is an important part of, I feel, of St. Charles history. And even though the stones are still in the pile, and that's the starting point of this story. So, Lori, can you grab the light?
Yes.
And as far as what you called it, Fort Peruque, and you're a military man, Craig, from what I understand, in like War of 1812, there were settlers whose homes were what was called forted up. And the reason they're called forts in the War of 1812, but they belonged to persons, they belonged to people. This was built by the military. This is truly what you call a military fort. So I don't know if it should be called Fort Peruque, Peruque Fort, but from what I understand, there's a difference between the two. So I'm not quite sure. I'm not military enough to know. So, what I'd like to lay out briefly is an explanation about Missouri and how this all came to be and came to be necessary. Before we actually were a state in 1804, when we were just brought in as Louisiana Territory, the laws that we had regarding slavery were essentially the same black code that was used in Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee, where so many of our earlier and our first settlers all came from. Many of them were Revolutionary War heroes, and many of them who had served in the Revolutionary War, for their service, in those days, the pay was a land warrant, a land bounty. And that's how so many of them would acquire their land. And they traded their land warrants amongst where they really wanted to go. And sometimes maybe they had a friend that was had served and he had a land warrant for northern Arkansas that somebody wanted to go into what was Missouri, and so on and so forth. So even that was changed around. Its original constitution for the state of Missouri not only allowed slavery, but it had a clause in it that forbid free blacks from coming into the territory. Missouri was supposed to fix this in the Constitution. It never really in our original Constitution even got fixed. It just got overlooked. And the whole reason for the consternation was in Congress, what was going on was more an argument about us being a state, a free state or a slave state, and here locally, most of the conversation between 1818 and 1821 was just simply conversation all about where the first state capital should be. So those two conversations were going on and overlooked the other. A lot of times people think it was a great thing about Henry Clay and his Missouri Compromise. It really, really wasn't the greatest. Henry Clay sort of figures into this whole story, and his compromise was that it should be a slave state, and it became a slave state because of his compromise, which put Maine as becoming a state in order for Missouri to enter as a slave state. And that's rather important too. So all of that had gone on by the time we became a state, and we were a very big slave state and very big on the actual idea of slavery that was prominent. This is an early newspaper, and it's talking all about, this is an 1824 map of Missouri, and we have these abolition enemies among us tampering with slaves, not only affording them means to escape, but personally superintending them and their efforts. It's now no longer a matter of doubt. The system of Negro stealing, once a matter of so much risk, is now boldly done in our midst, and slaves are taken away in broad daylight and shipped to their place of destination. Steamboats and railroads are ready to convey them, while there are those in this city who, on an emergency, find the means of facilitating their egress by furnishing them carriages and horses. This wholesale plunder will prove destructive to slave property in St. Louis and the adjoining counties unless steps of the most extraordinary kind are taken to prevent it. We have reason to know that there is a regular agency established in this city with 2 branches of the Underground Railroad. It is laid with black rails and conductors are white men. In other words, there are associations of Negroes in the city who are in correspondence with the abolitionists, who furnish them money and advice, and who are constantly running off slaves. So that was the temperament and the beliefs of any of the Southerner families. But also a really big event that happened in St. Charles County is a man named Godfrey Duden. He had come to Missouri because he'd heard about Daniel Boone and how the people were coming here. Germany was in really bad straits. It's not the country that we know today. And they were experiencing a lot of overpopulation and famine. And he had written this book about this area. He had actually, for 3 years, lived right here in St. Charles and Warren County. At that point, St. Charles County went and included what's today Warren County as well. So he had written this book in 1829 and published it. And at that point, we still have lots of Virginians and Southerners coming into the state, but because of Duden's book, there was also a lot of people that were German immigrants and foreigners coming in. By 1850, many of the counties, including St. Charles County, were over 50% foreign-born. Well, the Germans, they were very much anti-slavery. Wine cellars made great Underground Railroad hiding places, and things were in turmoil. 1850, the Missouri Compromise is repealed. By 1854, you've got the Dred Scott decision, and things are getting worse. So about 40,000 Germans would come to this state in the decades of the 1830s alone, just because of this book. So I had acquired this picture. The Civil War erupted in Missouri in May of 1861, when the governor first called for troops. Now, for those of you that weren't able to join us for Jim Irwin's All About the Enrolled Militia and all of the consternations about in Missouri's early enrollment, many of those families, when they were calls for troops, we had a Southern-leaning governor. He had not campaigned on the issue of the end of slavery or secession or any of that, but he immediately called a Constitution Convention to do that. But we did not secede, mainly because by that point, we had so many Germans. So you have people living as neighbors, some even in the same household. Edward Bates was Lincoln's Attorney General. His son, Barton Bates, lived in Darden Prairie on the Boone's Lake Road. And here you have Barton Bates, a Missouri federal judge, and he's a slave owner. He's a Union man. A Union man, which had slaves, was sometimes even called a haystacker. Haystack was the name for somebody that hid their feelings in the haystack. And I had acquired this picture, and I have to tell you that I know Lori had family that she knows that served at that. I don't know did his militia papers, did his muster roll ever say that he was at Peruque Fort?
Never mentioned that.
Huh?
I did mention Peru.
It did not. See, that's been the biggest problem for me. There are St. Charles regiments of the Home Guards. There are Cottleville Home Guards. There's Darden Home Guards. And I have taken this picture, which in the Historical Society, I know Henry Danker was the captain. That much I know. But Company E, Regiment 7 doesn't really make sense, A. And also, some of those men, I can't find any military service for at all. And not all of those men belong in the same regiment ever. So I think, as a genealogist, I think, oral history and stories and pictures quite often get mislabeled. And I'm not certain that I would say that these people are in there. I don't know what it was based on. But I don't think all of those names were there. Now, the North Missouri Railroad had come through Missouri in 1854. And in 1854, by that time, a man named Arnold Krekel, funny kind of sounding name, he had come, his father was a best friend of Godfrey Dewden. He had actually come to Missouri in 1832, and he is a young man, he's 17 years old, and he comes to Missouri. The first thing he does is he starts to learn English. He goes to school to earn money to go to St. Charles, the college at St. Charles. He eventually, he learns surveying. He eventually becomes an attorney. And in 1854, he is so prestigious by that time that he is actually on the board for the North Missouri Railroad. He knows the president, whose name is James O'Fallon, nephew of William Clark, and he knows where that railroad is going. And he buys 320 acres at the perfect spot. Hey, it's not always what you know, but who you know. Which is why O'Fallon became O'Fallon. And he has bought 320 acres along the railroad. The railroads in those days are steam engines. The railroads need water and wood and water every so many miles. And he is at the perfect distance from St. Charles as a railroad stop, which is how O'Fallon came to be. Just past the city of O'Fallon, though, is a very large gorge. And it's over 300 feet deep. At the bottom of it flows Darden Creek. By the time of the Civil War, Arnold Krekel had established the city of O'Fallon, or I should say his brother, who was the first resident, Nicholas Krekel. Nicholas owns the General Mercantile. Nicholas gets made to be the station master, and anybody that's a station master is also a postmaster. So he has set up his younger brother, Nicholas, in O'Fallon, but he has by this time not only enlisted, but he has made and become lieutenant colonel, and he is what's called the provost marshal. Missouri by this time is under martial law. What that means is the civil courts are suspended, and if you have a problem with your neighbor, it's not a civil court issue. And anything that goes on has to go to the provost marshal. Now, Arnold Krekel lives in St. Charles We've all heard the stories of the mill on Main Street, where the roof of the mill was where the soldiers looked out on the railroad and the river and kept watch there. It was used as a hospital inside, so was the military school. And what has happened by 1861, in I think July, I'm not 100% sure I remember that one right. I think it's July. In 1861, there was an incident to where the area, just like so many others, was experiencing an ambush just west of Wentzville. When you have both Confederates and Union in the same area, and Missouri has become a Union-held state, as my friend from New York once said, yeah, they occupied. And I said, well, you could call it that. It was their home. So they did occupy Missouri as a Union, but the reason is because they lived here. So you have both factions here in Missouri. And things are very, very difficult because of that, because you don't always know who is doing what. 1861, July, Wentzville, the Confederates had tried to ambush and sabotage the tracks west of town and wouldn't let the train pass. So the military realizes they've got a problem because the North Missouri Railroad is a vital link for the Union. This goes clear to Jeff City. This goes to Mexico, Missouri, where the big round table was and where many of their troops were stationed up there in Little Dixie. By the way, I gave a talk on Archer in Little Dixie Library the other day. That was an experience. But the point of these railroads was very important. This not only carried troops, this carried supplies, carried food. In the wintertime, there's stoves that are burning inside. So these are very vital, the rail to the Union troops, these railroad. And as you can see in the background, and if anybody can't see, right there is a wooden trestle bridge. Oh. This sits on the highest peak of parcel of land. This is 500 at 550 feet right here. It's sitting on top of, and that's where that railroad is going through. So anything that falls is going to fall 500 feet. It's going to do a lot of damage. So the military instructs the Lieutenant Colonel Arnold Krekel, and he instructs the military that they're going to need to build a fort. Well, the thing about any place that the Union military is and has taken up camp, when you're in an area, and even if not, but there were the troop followers that were what you call contraband. They have not been, the abolitionists will help them, but they are not free. They are not even freed in 1863 with Lincoln's emancipation. By 1862 even, they were contraband property. So I was just in Harrisonville and I heard a story of where Bleeding Kansas was about to happen. This is beforehand. And the Union Army had literally was going into homes and taking slaves and taking them over to Kansas. Kansas had become a free state. I had never heard such a story. But here, it was more Underground Railroad. And what the enslaved often did is stay at the Union camps. They got as close as they could. They would cut wood. They would keep the fires burning. They do whatever they could to help. Now, after 1863, when the U.S. colored troops could be armed up, quite often these contraband camps were more women and the washerwomen and the families. think about it, when the man runs off to war and she's left behind, that's one thing if you're a white woman. But if you're enslaved property and your husband's gone off and joined, your master steals your mail and there are other problems. So this was also, I know, a place that this fort was harbored a contraband camp. It had a cistern for water, a well and cistern, and it has the cemetery there. Now, another thing that Arnold Krekel was, this allowed also, when I was doing research for another thing, the Smith Chapel Cemetery up in Forestell. There is a family that lives north of here called Martin, and they have an enslaved man born on the property named Martin Boyd. He has two brothers. In 1860, and by 1864, late 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of the enslaved men wanted to join the U.S. colored troops. This was also being used as an enlistment site. Martin Boyd and his two brothers were aiming to get to, I'm going to move on to 1878 and stop quickly and show you what this land looked like. This is St. Charles and County and this township. Zooming in closer, you see the railroad, of course, and you see Peruque Creek. Now, for your also important information, because when all of this, I was first studying it at the St. Charles County Historical Society, what I myself didn't know is Peruque Creek goes all the way up to the Mississippi. And there is another railroad there. There's a railroad branch, but it's not the North Missouri Railroad A, and that's not an important branch for the Union. And it doesn't jive with a lot of other history. So you can see that here on this map, this guy named Henry owns this Spanish land grant. And these are considered buildings, that's what they are. And here on this survey, there's a building there, a building there. There's Mr. Henry's spot. And there is what sits on that spot today. This is the building that was being built. This is the cemetery fence, and these are the headstones. There's this where the fort stood and the cemetery. And to look over that, you can see through this map, Interstate 70, this north turned right, you come down here, and there is Peruque Crossing Court. I mean, golly, you got an arrow right to it. It's pretty good. And at the end of Peruque Crossing Court is that building that I just showed you. And this overlays land, and topographically, you can see it's the highest point in the area. Now, there were two forts, but they didn't both look like that. There is one that looks just like that, but there's another one that's just more of a one-story, very same roof, and that sits on the other side of the tracks. You can, in some photos I have, see one for the other. You can see they are within sight of each other. And on here, what you're looking at, because this is all elevations, here's the spot that the railroad goes by and the creek goes down. Is that better, Greg, that I Got that in there?
Yeah.
I knew we'd want that. One of the stories that's important with the history of the Fort Peruque is of an individual that had heard and overheard his enslavers at a Confederate meeting held in the back of Naylor's store every Sunday night. And he had overheard them planning on and saying that they were sawing the underneath the timbers, the wooden timbers. Now, he hears this in January of 1863. And at that point, January was a really cold, 1863. The river even becomes frozen. The steamboats have stopped. In January, you not only got a train, but you got a train that troops are being kept warm with wood stoves. And they are sawing the timbers, and they have guns stored in a local person's house. So they are planning not only to ambush, they're planning on that train collapsing down and that bridge totally collapsing. Now this man, fortunately, Arch Alexander, took and went from Naylor's store, which is about across the street from the Darden Prairie City Hall. Isn't it great when you can do local references? And that's where Naylor's store was, on the Boomslick Road. And he ran about 5 miles at night on a cold winter's night and informed the captain that what they were planning. The trains not only were stopped so that nothing could happen, but they visited Mr. Campbell's house the next day, and just as Arch Alexander had stated, they did find the guns and ammunition that he had reported. Now, it's really a brave thing for anyone to report on your neighbors and what they're planning with something like this. I don't know how many people would get involved, as you might say. But these were tough times, and he did do that. Well, after that, everybody in the neighborhood knew what was going on. After all the trains had been stopped, they'd taken Campbell's guns. Somebody squealed, and they were going all around to the different farms looking for that. In February, by that time, things had gotten so bad that he not only, he knew that they were coming, and that he, with 16 other men, all from farms right in that area, they had zeroed in, knew that they were going to be talked to and interrogated, and they fled across the Missouri River. Archer did make it to St. Louis later on.
Doris?
Yeah?
Before Archer reported his plot to the Union forces, what prior contact had he had with the Union to establish his trustworthiness, etc.? I haven't heard you describe that previously.
What I think or what I can prove. You know I hate to talk about things I can't document 3 times over.
Well, with the caveat, what you
With
think.
the caveat, Archer had been brought with others enslaved in a caravan in 1829. He had lived for 30 years in the area, and he had the unusual circumstance of being an enslaved man when his master died in the cholera epidemic in 35, that what was happening at that point was he wasn't sold off. He had an agent, the executor of the estate. And so he was leased. He was a cabinet maker, a carpenter, a stonemason, a brick maker. He had been worked in the brickyards. And the Germans at this time, there are many stories of slaves coming to their doors and begging for help. And he apparently worked a lot with them, and they would slip them extra money. So he is well known in the community. He's built he's helped build houses, stonemasons, and yes, he knows the right people. And I'm sure he knew Mr. Krekel, or Lieutenant Colonel, I should say. Did that help?
I thank you, I had forgotten how long his history in the area
Yeah.
preceded this event.
And that's why, he's born in Virginia, but that's why I call him a Missouri slave. He's called the last fugitive slave in Missouri, but that's why. 35 years of your life, you live in one place. So this is where the fort was that he was reporting. And there was also, as I said, there was also a freedom seeker named Martin Boyd, who is buried at the Smith Chapel Cemetery up in Florestal. The Smith Chapel Cemetery was established in 1871 when a whole group of U.S. colored troops returned to the area. Flint Hill and north of Wentzville, Wentzville is a tobacco town, and this was a very much Confederate area. And that's where Smith Chapel is. And one of the people buried there is named Benjamin Oglesby, which his family farm, when he bought after the war with his war bounty, is Oglesby Park. So, which is being developed by the St. Charles County Parks, which William here knows real well. So, anyhow, the next thing is, so this is the information that I have gained as far as who owns it, but, whoops. It hasn't done me much good. So, I'm going to return to the part with the great map. I don't know if it's that one, probably that one. But the thing is that there's this overlook right there of land. And when you approach the cemetery behind the Edward Jones building of 1052, there is a cemetery there, at least it looks like one. And Greg here has been really helpful and sent me a lot of paperwork that comes from the Historical Society. Some of the places and some of the references themselves, they correct themselves. And this is right at Gilmore Road, and there are subdivisions, there are new buildings, there are gas stations, there is development left and right. And while the building in front of the cemetery is an Edward Jones office and property management, I don't think it's endangered in any way. But before I took a tour there in September, which I'd like to do, or stood up the stones, I really feel the property owner does need to give his permission. So I did my 45 minutes, and now you'll all do what you all do best. Is everything I didn't think to tell you and answer all your questions. I'll try. I will try. So, did that explain what the history of Fort Peruque and how it came to be and why it came to be and what kind of fort it was? And the military, Arnold Krekel, I had found it, but I couldn't find it back yesterday. Arnold Krekel's report that he made to his superiors in November of 1862, where he describes the fort, he matches it, he tells where it's at, he tells the dimensions, and in November of 62, he says it's complete. So we know it's there. Yes, Jerry.
You mentioned the importance of the Northern Missouri Railroad crossing the state and so forth. My question is, this is a field from Fort Peruque, but nearest next fort to the east and west, how well defended was the railroad along its length?
I've never
What do you know?
researched that, and I do know that from my knowing history of Warrenton and Wright City, I know that there was an attack, I don't remember the date, I wrote about it 30 years ago. An attack in Wright City, where it went along Wright City, and Confederates had lined the tracks in the bushes, and they had attacked the railroad, shooting at the cars, trying to pick off the soldiers. I know that in Warrenton, at one date, they took out what's called the Red Hill Bridge, which is just on the west side of Warrenton. It's still there, but it's a metal bridge, just like the bridge is in O'Fallon today. But they did take down that one. But as far as another fort, I've never really searched on that. How much time do I have?
What, do you sleep?
I found this one and I found out its history, and you know why, because of my current book, but I don't know if there were any others. I really couldn't say. It's a good question. Maybe, maybe I should ask who, like Greg Wolk, Missouri Civil War database. Maybe somebody else knows. That's a good question. But the railroad runs clear across the state, so it's very important. And the railroads were important. This is how their pay moved. This is how food and supplies are moved. This is how troops are moved. This is vital. If you want to attack your enemy and that, you're not going to let anybody know that you're a Confederate sympathizer, but that's what you're going to do. That's what the war was all about in Missouri and in St. Charles.
How many years was the fort there?
I really feel that those buildings that are shown on the 1875 map are them. I think that, but I can't, of course, prove that. And I have seen like old accounts that the fort stood. I know that along in that area, along there was at one point a post office that they said was the old fort, but it doesn't look at all like the fort. I know, and Doug is not here tonight, there is a fort called Fort Wood in Woods Fort in Troy. And it looks just like this. And it is supposed to have been built for the War of 1812. Doug insists that it's not built for the same war, but it looks just like it, and it's called Woods Fort, and it's in the square in the center of Troy.
Dorris, I guess, I'm famous for my questions that are really comments, so I'll just say it's a comment. When I was getting this paperwork together that I sent you, one of the things I mentioned in there is that they estimate there are about 50 lost cemeteries like this just in St. Charles County alone. Family cemeteries or historical cemeteries that we just bulldozed and put subdivisions over and didn't move the remains. And there may have been one along Guthrie Road there also further down that they just, when they went to move Guthrie Road, they just paved over it. And so this just represents one of several what I think are tragedies. Because if that's your grandparents.
There's accounts in all the cemetery books putting in Interstate 70 as they're coming through Wentzville. They dig up 4 black graves. I mean, how they knew they were that, I do not know. Smith Cemetery is a black cemetery. Sage is black. They don't all have headstones. Sometimes they're field stones, they're homemade stones. These stones that are piled in this corner are regular headstones. I'm interested to find out if they are soldiers and are perhaps somebody that died while serving there for some reason that didn't go home. Because that's the other thing you have to understand, and I should bring this up.